Goblins and Trolls, those green skin monsters that pop up in all of our classic fantasy role-playing games, whether we're talking about stuff like Magic or D&D, or we're talking about video games like God of War. Trolls and goblins come up often, and even if there are sneaky assassins or brutal bruisers, these characters, these monsters continue to pop up in the games that we make. But today we're going to consider the historical origins of Goblins and Trolls. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle and welcome to Desks and Dorks. A couple things: if you like the content we make, the YouTube pleasantries liking and specifically sharing these videos goes a long way to helping us out. The best way to support us, however, is by purchasing games from a couple different sources. You can get physical copies from Exalted Funeral, Indie Press Revolution, or Worldwise Distribution. You can also get PDFs by following either the QR code on your screen or by using the link in the description below, and you can in fact enjoy becoming Banana Bread and Red Panda Redemption. Usually you have to pay for those, but those games are free. It's my thank you to the Desks and Dorks community, because you, as of right now, can download 17 free games as part of Desks and Dorks' first ever community game jam. That game jam anthology, featuring art by our very own Smoke Seller, who does a lot of our channel art, is available now. I would encourage you to get a download. You can get actually 3 free products from us right now. So, I mean, even if you don't wind up paying something, you can follow that link, get yourself some free goodies. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we're talking about today. If you're new to the channel, I was trained as a medievalist, and I pursued a career in game design and game publishing. So, I like combining those two loves. So today we're going to be looking at the origins of both goblins and trolls, both in history and in folklore, the differences between those depictions and how they relate to our games. And then lastly, I'm going to give you some suggestions to help you use those monsters in your game. So you can expect some variant rules, some house rules, some cool monsters that you can chuck into any system, because as always, our stuff is system and setting agnostic, which means that you can play this in everything from Shadow of the Demon Lord to Morkborg to, you know, that one game that people seem to like a lot with the D20s that I made a whole video about me not particularly enjoying. A couple caveats, however. I was trained as a Eurocentric medievalist. This means that I will be leaving out wide swaths of the historical world. This is done intentionally because I do not believe that I have the training and nuance to treat those subjects and those areas with the respect that they deserve. Those areas are worth engaging with, those time periods, those cultures are worth engaging with. I just feel like I do not have the ability to represent them properly. That's why I'm leaving them out. And again, please use safety tools if you're going to lean into the horrific. Obviously, I don't think we're going to be talking about anything super spooky in this particular video, but as always, just make sure you're checking on your players and make sure that everyone's doing a good time. So, with that out of the way, let's start with trolls. This was one of the most shocking and eye-opening things this entire video, because I realized just how much the pop cultural creation of a troll is different from the actual historical representation of these beings. But I particularly like this piece of art from our good pal John Bauer, who did this in 1915. So for those of you not in the know, trolls first appear in a text called the Prose Edda. This is a collection of short stories, written text, essentially sometimes even just scraps of text, also includes some poems and what are like apocryphal histories of the Norse world. And this is the first time that trolls appear in written form. However, as many anthropologists and historians have noted, the abundance of troll stories in Norse and Nordic culture means that likely trolls were a large part of an oral tradition of storytelling. It's just that we don't have access to that. Now, again, much like a person can look at the crater caused by a meteor, even if the meteor has long since eroded, and conclude the impact that that had. You know, we can conclude the impact of the trolls because of how many references there are to them. However, we don't have access to the oral tradition, obviously, because that has either A, been lost to time, or B, evolved and changed into something different as, you know, it progresses from storyteller to storyteller. This is actually a common problem that came up quite often during this video's research process, where a lot of the local legends and a lot of the things that we, you know, would potentially be using primary sources, even anecdotal sources, are pretty hard to come by because of how important the oral tradition of these monsters is. And this is really true for the trolls. So, I mean, again, shout out to the Norse, love them, but, you know, they did not do a great job of writing everything down. However, there are some similarities in the trolls of Norse and Nordic legend. Specifically, however, I am referring to the trolls of Norway. So again, this comes up a little bit, especially with folkloric creatures, if there are several areas that both share a same or similar geographic location and similar cultures and linguistic structures, you're going to have similar legends with some differences in between. However, trolls first appear in Nordic culture in Norway in the Prose Edda, and that is why I am focusing specifically on them. So my Danes and my Finns, please don't come at me in the comments. There is a reason that we're doing this. With that being said, let's continue. One of the similarities that you can find in both the Legends of the Prose Edda and in the little fragments of that oral tradition on trolls that we have access to is in their anatomy. Trolls in both modern fantasy role-playing and in the historical record seem to have access to similar appendages, right? These long or elongated arms, the coloration, whether these are like dark greens or like more muted bluish grays, and that long pronounced nose. Those seem to be similarities not just in the folklore, but in our fantasy role-playing games in general. It seems like this was a major touchstone when fantasy authors and fantasy game designers were taking inspiration from these original legends. And speaking of the coloration, this is really important because something that comes up often both in the folklore and the historical records or historical legends on trolls is that color seems to be mostly the same in between, the historical record on trolls, the folklore on trolls, and the way that trolls are presented in games. We talk a lot about those greens, the yellows, the browns, those sort of muted grade blues, and this makes a ton of sense. These creatures would have been very deeply tied to the natural world in the folklore and in Dungeons and Dragons or in other classic fantasy role-playing games. They're sort of tied to this green skin menace, the orcs, the goblins, the trolls, what have you. And as a result of that, they tend to share these similar colors. I think this is really particularly interesting, at least for me as a historian and as a game designer, because this is more true for the folklore trolls. There seems to be much more of a deep-seated connection to the natural world for those trolls in those kinds of legends, particularly in the Prose Edda. And I really think that's kind of neat. It sort of acts as a natural camouflage. Those of you who have ever been hunting in an alpine area during the winter know that it's just not a bunch of whites and grays. There are blues, these sort of deep-seated greens, muted browns, all of that kind of stuff you can see in the classic troll color palette. So I think that's a pretty interesting similarity, and I do think the modern fantasy role-playing game gets this mostly right. And lastly, we have to talk about habitat. This is one of the things that does come up often in the Prose Edda and in the fragments of the oral tradition that we still have with us, but trolls seem to like isolated areas in the mountains, in cave systems, or on those sort of seaside caves along the coast or on fjords. That seems to be where they like to live. And this, I think, is mostly true in our modern role-playing game aesthetic, whether we're talking about something like Skyrim with its frost trolls, who like the big mountainous caverns, or, again, the trolls of classic pen and paper fantasy role-playing games, who seem to take their time getting to out-of-the-way areas. These are all similarities between the folkloric and historic representation of trolls and the way they're presented in our classic modern tabletop role-playing games. But now it's time for us to discuss the differences between trolls as a folkloric interpretation and the one in modern fantasy tabletop role-playing. You see, there are quite a few differences, but I really wanted to narrow down a couple of them, and the first one I want to talk about is related to the classic world of Tolkienesque mythology. You see, there is this myth that the trolls die in sunlight or are weak to sunlight, or if you're going through the classic modern, role-playing game landscape, incredibly weak to fire. And while it does seem that trolls are weak to fire insofar as, every living thing is weak to fire, I could find no major references in the historical or in the folklore to really back up this claim. In fact, this really, I think, comes from a later story and a later addition to one of the Eddas, where a troll is essentially hit by lightning, and that is attributed to an act of divine intervention on the part of God. And there is actually one thing where a troll is startled and in fact hurt, damaged, forced to flee because of the ringing of church bells. So again, there really isn't anything quite like this sort of the trolls turning to stone mythos. I do think that does get mentioned in a later legend, I think dating back to 1600, but I couldn't find any of it in the original, or at least in the furthest back sources. So this, at least to me, strikes like Christian revisionism and like something that would have been tacked on to these legends and these folkloric depictions much later on. And because of that, this sort of sensitivity to fire, to lightning, these things kind of have maintained themselves into our modern landscape of tabletop role-playing games. But again, lightning and the sounds of church bells, that's the only things that I could find, and those legends occur far after the first appearance of trolls in history and in folklore. Another one of the things that I think pops up quite a bit is the sort of green skin menace, and I'm going to blame Games Workshop for this one in particular, because while I do love me some orc boys, till the end, it seems like this sort of picks up steam because of the Games Workshop depiction, and later because of Blizzard, who adopts, the green skin menace sort of thing that Games Workshop was working with for the fantasy tabletop game. But the concept that I'm talking about is the idea that trolls are these sort of ravaging raiders, these reavers, these creatures that will seek out and plunder this. They will hunt, find, and stalk prey whenever they can. And while that does make for a compelling in-game villain and for a very interesting NPC. Again, conflict breeds intrigue in your games, so it makes sense that we would have something like that in the tabletop role-playing game sphere. In the legends that I read and in the folkloric depictions, trolls seem less like ravaging bandits and more like lone wolves. It seems like trolls are opportunistic hunters rather than ones who are aggressive hunters. Think of them kind of like a coyote or like a vulture. They can, in fact, fight and will in fact fight if the need arises, but they're far more likely to sit on the fringes of civilization, according to the legends and the folklore, as opposed to, I don't know, besieging a town and trying to sack it. Depending on the legend that you look at, trolls have a steady diet of sometimes rocks, occasionally lost livestock, farm animals, or small game that wanders into their territories, and depending on the legend's target audience, small children. Again, this does not seem to be a commonality in the Eddas. This seems to be more of an old wives' tale or a popular oral tradition used to sort of scare children into obeying their parents. So it's nice to know that, human parents everywhere have been making up random garbage to scare their children into behaving. Sometimes it's trolls, other times it's the Rizzler. That's not a sentence I thought I'd say as an adult historian in my 30s, but you know what? Here we are. Again, it's really important for us to take into account, however, that trolls, at least according to the legends and the depictions that I could find, do not want to strike out and go hunting all of the time. It seems like they're far more content to be opportunistic hunters and find whatever food is made readily available to them when it is made readily available to them. Hunters of convenience, I think, is probably the best way to put it. Also, structure tends to be a really big thing. In most of the stuff that happens in the popular role-playing game sphere, there's usually one or two types of trolls. There is the war troll, the troll as part of a greater ravening horde. This is true whether we're talking about the fantasy of Warhammer or the fantasy of Lord of the Rings. But again, the war troll seems to be a really, really big deal within the fantasy role-playing game landscape. And that makes sense, right? It's a large, imposing creature, usually being led by far more cunning and far better organized individuals. And I think that makes, again, for a very compelling and very intriguing NPC or enemy for our players to confront. The other really popular one that I have found within the modern fantasy game landscape is the idea of the troll as this sort of individualized hermit, this great beast or being that lives a solitary, lonely life. And both of these depictions are not at all accurate to the original legends. In fact, most of the legends of trolls that I could find do seem to place them within some sort of family unit. Sometimes this is a parent and a couple children, sometimes it is a single troll parent and their offspring, but in the Prose Edda and in the legends, or at least what we have left of those original oral legends, it does seem like trolls have a more tight-knit familial structure, and that's, again, that kind of echoes the importance of the themes. Something to come up, and by the themes I mean, something that's important for us to consider when we're reading folklore, and this has nothing to do with history and everything to do with my other love, which is textual analysis, but it's something for us to consider, right? People don't make legends and folklore for no reason. And to the Norse, who are a people who are forced to sort of live on the fringes, or at the very least in inhospitable places due to their lifestyle and due to the migrations of their ancestors, the idea of individuals by themselves is probably a really dangerous one. If you are going to live in those climes, it makes sense to me that you would have to lean on your community. And so, again, both as somebody who wants to study history and as somebody who does do textual analysis and, writes text for a living, this makes sense that the trolls, these monsters, would wind up echoing a greater value in Norse culture about the importance of community is a method and a means to survive. I think that's a really important thing. And now we get to talk about goblins, baby. And if you can't tell from my narration, I love goblins. I love them when they are helpful little critters who just sort of run around and assist your party, essentially acting like, I don't know, anthropomorphic raccoons and trash gremlins, just assisting where needed and biting the ankles of your enemies. I love them when they are horrible antagonists, like in things like Goblin Slayer, where they jump into battle against your foes. I love goblins when I get to destroy them when they attempt to ambush me, the little jerks. Get out of my canyon pass. I am trying to engage in regular mercantile endeavors. I love goblins no matter which way I slice it. But it is interesting, at least for me, that the depiction of goblins and goblinoids varies incredibly. And I don't even mean this just like it varies in between like the actual historical folklore and the interpretation of how it works in the modern tabletop RPG. No, I mean like just in general, goblin and goblinoid generally tends to be a catch-all term. I will say that most of this similarity, however, is that goblins are not tiny little green creatures at all. Almost every legend that I found, the one big similarity, even in Europe, is that goblin is sort of a catch-all term for an evil or a mischievous spirit of some kind. So think less like a tiny green short stack and more like Casper the Mischievous Ghost. I'll be honest, like if you had an incorporeal mogwai and incorporeal gremlin, that's probably closer to how these legends would have originally been interpreted and passed down. We have a lot of the same problems that we do with Trolls 2, where there's a vast verbal tradition that we have sort of lost quite a lot of, but in terms of the Goblin legend, they get a lot more out of it. The impact crater is a lot higher. They get their first written mention, much like the Trolls in the Prose Edda. They get their first written mention in the 12th century, but what I thought was kind of interesting, at least for all of us, at least those of you who grew up playing fantasy role-playing games, is that the term goblin originates from kobalos, which is Greek for rogue. It's also the term where we get the word kobold from, which I thought was kind of neat. And this linguistic connection goes quite a long way, I think, in explaining the strategic and lore connection between kobolds and goblins in fantasy role-playing. I thought that was kind of a neat little connect. However, we have to talk about types of goblins. There are several of them. This is a depiction of Puck, by the way, because types of goblins pop up often in the fantasy role-playing game landscape. I keep saying that a lot. That's so many times. But things like Puck, for example, is a hobgoblin. Hobgoblins, in particular, in the legends and in the folklore, are not evil. They are mischievous at worst and generally pretty helpful at best, which means that, again, Puck, being a hobgoblin, has more in common with this than he does with, I don't know, the giant armored monsters in the Monster Manual. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that the Gesta Romanorum, which is a 13th century manuscript, depicts the tale of helpful goblins that assist knights in their quest. This goblin, which wore a red robe, a la Santa Claus, I think is kind of intriguing, would essentially follow knights around on difficult journeys, and then had a magic horn that would allow the knight to drink out of, and the knight would feel refreshed, they would heal from wounds, they would be ready to fight, which I think actually makes this the first ever real interpretation or appearance of the health potion as we understand it in the history. Now, I'm not saying that potions don't come up earlier or the depiction of potions come up earlier, but let's look at the similarities, right? This potion of refreshment is given as a reward during a quest. It is given by a helpful NPC, and it is specifically only given to knights that are on a quest. So again, this is the first appearance, or at least that I can think of, or that I have seen, of a health potion as we would understand it in the modern RPG parlance in history. That's really cool, and it's something that I learned just in doing the research for this video. I thought that you would all like it as well. But essentially, before we, dive too deeply into health potions or other fun historical coincidences, I think it's important for us to realize that the historical and folkloric depiction of goblins is essentially nothing like the ones that we get from modern fantasy. I'll be completely and totally honest. There are very, very few, if any, that I can think of. They make mischief. That's, a thing, I guess. But for the most part, these are either, again, evil spirits meant to be battled, a catch-all term for some fae, if you're talking about some of the Celtic legends, but for the most part are either mischievous or helpful spirits of some kind, which means that they are essentially nothing like the goblins that you would see in something like D&D. Again, the differences here are huge. Their morals, the goblins in the folklore, seem far more interested in either making amusement or helping others than hurting. The difference of being a spirit, an incorporeal being, or a fae, depending on whether we're looking at English, Welsh, or Celtic legend, and their desire to help and assist others is a huge thing. So again, the way that we have interpreted goblins in the pop culture tabletop RPG sphere has essentially nothing in common with the way that goblins were originally interpreted and talked about in the history and in the folklore. But all of this begs the question, why are the depictions in folklore and history so different, and why do they change so rapidly, right? Like, why is it that we think trolls are vulnerable to fire? Why is it that trolls are being, chased out and chased away, by the power of church bells? Why is it that goblins are originally conceived of as, kindly spirits, but then later on pop up as evil villains in things like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's work? And that has to come down to one very important factor, and that is the rise of Christendom in medieval Europe. Look, let's talk about this right now, because I've said this in multiple videos, and again, as somebody who was trained as a medievalist, I might not be a practicing one, but I do have my training. There was no greater force in unifying medieval Europe, and also in destroying parts of its culture, than the Catholic Church. This is especially true when it comes to folklore and when it comes to those local histories. The church had a vested interest in co-opting, changing, and altering the legends of the people that were around it, particularly those who began as pagan, in order to sort of bring them into the fold. This is a common evangelization tactic among medieval Catholic missionaries and medieval Catholic priests. Even the Prose Edda, which I relied on for some of the research in this video, came out in about 1200, long after Christianity and Catholicism had already made their way into the medieval areas of Scandinavia. This means that for whatever reason, again, whether they are attempting to co-opt the natural folklore and history of a place in order to get those people to convert, or whether the esteemed establishment believes that those things are a threat to the order of Catholicism, all of that plays a role in why these folklores are so different, and why, as time goes on, these depictions of those monsters become so wildly different. Again, I think this is important for us to mention, because even the sources that I was able to find have had, at least in some way, shape, or form, some Christian and Catholic influence that has seeped into them. And because most of these legends began as oral traditions and were predominantly oral traditions, it means that we have to take what we've got with a grain of salt, and an understanding that these would have been changed or altered to fit the evangelization needs of the largest and most powerful institution in medieval Europe. But now that we've discussed the importance of Catholicism as an altering force in history and folklore, and we've talked a little bit about the differences of these creatures between their modern fantasy versions and the historic and folkloric counterparts, let's talk about how to include them in our games. I have included 3 separate different monsters for your viewing and playing pleasure. The idea with the first 2 is that they echo the actual historic and folkloric record. They are more accurately related to these creatures as they would have been known historically and in the medieval past. And my third one is one where I just said screw it and threw all caution to the wind and just made the most unhinged thing that I possibly could. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about one of our trolls. Our first one that I want to discuss when we talk about trolls and goblins in our games is Ulvarstad. Ulvarstad is a lone troll, which, as you know by watching this video, is an uncommon thing. However, Ulvarstad is only alone because their family has essentially been slain by troll hunters who wanted to save, quote-unquote, the village. As a method of revenge, Ulvarstad is essentially slowly working his way toward the village. He's testing its defenses. He's using camouflage in the woods and the fjords, and by doing so, giving himself opportunities to pick off lone hunters and gatherers. Again, he's sort of taking out all of the able-bodied individuals in the village first before he decides to make his inevitable strike. I see Ulvarstad as more of a tragic villain or a desperate antagonist. Ulvarstad doesn't particularly care if he's going to live through this final penultimate encounter. Ulvarstad is far more interested in being able to take as many of those individuals with him as humanly possible, or in this case, as trolly possible. Because of this, however, he's not willing to engage hunters, or in your case, the party, if they're going to go out and try to find them. Remember, he has a goal, and if the village takes on, adventurers as mercenaries to try to drive Ulvarstad back or slay him, he's not going to bother to engage, both because A, he's too savvy to do so, and B, they're not on his hit list, so he's not going to particularly care. Oh, by the way, this is a good time for me to segue and tell you that the art done here and in our next section is done by Smokeseller, our resident channel artist, who absolutely cooked with Gulpin. Gulpin is a helpful alchemical spirit. I envision Gulpin as the spirit of essentially like maybe a child or somebody who didn't get a chance to sort of live a long life. Maybe they died in a lab accident, but essentially Gulpin manifests themselves as this tiny little green childlike figure, but they specifically help those who are scientifically adventurous. I thought this was a nice riff on the idea that goblins in general seem to be helpful towards adventurers, and I thought, well, what greater adventure could there be for a scholar than plumbing the depths of human knowledge and understanding of the universe? And so Gulpin takes his cues from those wonderful scholars and specifically helps the scientifically gifted. When Gulpin is present, he allows individuals to function for far less than their normal amount of sleep usually needed. I desperately need Gulpin in my own life as I realize my sleep schedule has been shot to ribbons. However, the other cool thing is that any aspiring alchemist that is present and around Gulpin, they can treat their equipment as if it was far better quality, and part of that is Gulpin's presence, and part of that is the magic that he imbues on the adventuresome and the adventurely gifted. Now, I get to talk about my unhinged idea. It's not a fastball special. No. It's a fast food special. You see, I thought about the core tenets of Trolls and Goblins as we know them and understand them in classic tabletop role-playing. Goblins, small, vicious, horrible little cretins, and trolls large and can regenerate. And so the idea is that the troll will consume the goblin without chewing. Now again, this would largely cause too much damage, but because the troll has regenerative properties in the modern RPG landscape, they're able to sort of, stomach skadooch that damage. As a result, both troll and goblin begin the encounter injured, but what's kind of neat is that the troll regurgitates the goblin at a rapid clip, essentially spitting out a acid bile covered goblin into the party members. Now, you could do all manner of horrific things with this. You could have the bile do acid damage. You could have the goblin be absolutely shattered and their bones essentially work like a grenade when they ram into the party, doing splash damage of some kind. Or maybe the goblins got smart and they have like little metal capsules that they sort of like roll, like giant roly-polies, or like the droid echoes from Star Wars, where the troll regurgitates this big metal orb with a goblin inside, and the goblin emerges from the metal orb and starts fighting. Either way, I thought this was a completely nonsense and unhinged idea, and because of that, I think it's awesome and arguably my favorite thing that I've cooked up for this video, which is pretty great. Sadly, not as cute as Gulpin, but you know what, that's alright. With that being said, folks, I will make a deal with you. So many people in the comments and in the voting for this video wanted dwarves and werewolves to get their own video. These take quite a lot of time, and I'll be honest, I'm taking a little bit of a risk as a creator. Usually, this would be a regular historical RPG video, and instead I'm focusing on the history of monsters, but so many people voted for this that I thought it was worth taking the risk. I told you in the original voting that the two monsters that lost, in this case dwarves and werewolves, are essentially relegated to the void. But if the video hits 500 likes, I will do dwarves and werewolves. That is my solemn promise as the dork of Desks and Dorks. I will do dwarves and werewolves, but only if we hit that. So, ball is in your court. If you want to see the historical origins of dwarves and werewolves and how I would interpret those in games, 500 likes. So share it, spam it to people, sacrifice a goat to the dark gods, whatever it takes for you to get 500 likes if you want that to be a thing. Otherwise, I'm sorry, dwarves and werewolves, they get relegated to oblivion. With that being said, if you like the work that we do here, all of the YouTube pleasantries really do help us out. It's the single best way to support us. It's also the single best way for you to get dwarves and werewolves. If you want those things, again, the best way to help me keep the lights on is by purchasing our games over at the description, which again, you can get them for Worldwide Distribution, Indie Press Revolution, or Exalted Funeral, or in the link or following the QR code, which will take you to our itch.io page, where for the rest of the next couple days, you can still get Becoming Banana Bread and Red Panda Redemption for free, and you'll always be able to get the Desks and Dorks Game Jam Anthology for free. Following this section is going to be our Q&A, where members of the community ask questions related to this topic, Goblins and Trolls. But if this is where we part ways, you have been absolutely awesome. I have been Kyle for Desks and Dorks, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. Hello, Dad Bod. What's up, everybody? This is the Q&A section. We made it. I hope y'all like this. For those of you who are brand new to the channel or just joining us for the first time, this is an unedited section where I respond to community questions either in the YouTube comments or in the Discord. Links in the Discord below if you want to take part in that. So, Cool Person asks, where does the troll under the bridge originate? So I think the most part is that it just kind of originates from children's rhymes and apocryphal, or in this case, oral tradition stories. Again, it makes sense that, like, the troll would be under the bridge. It's kind of the closest thing we have to, like, a cave in a setting that people are constantly in. But again, I think it just falls back to a far more intriguing or interesting oral tradition. So I don't think we have, at least not that I could find, a single set date for when the troll under the bridge thing happens. Cool Person also asked, how would you interact with these creatures? How scary is a smart goblin and why? So I guess it depends on like what kind of goblin I'm interacting with, right? Are these the helpful or mostly helpful or mischievous spirits in original, Anglo-Saxon folklore, in which case I will treat them with respect and maybe give them a cookie. I imagine goblins would love Thin Mints. I don't know why, but like I know in my heart of hearts and my soul of souls that a goblin would absolutely freaking crush Girl Scout cookies. Like, you know it to be true. A goblin would just like put a hurtin' on a pack of Samoas. So unless now if these are like evil goblins like in modern fantasy, kick them, don't go into dark pits. I don't know, fire, probably, in general. It just depends. Kavadi asked, when did the trend of goblins being cute instead of crusty start, and why? Interestingly enough, again, this is based on the research, I don't know if goblins were ever cute, but I do feel like it's kind of cyclical, right? Like, they started as kind of mischievous and helpful, and then over time became crusty as that part of the myth starts to get Christianized, and now they're kind of back. So I actually feel like, if anything, it starts at the very beginning, and we're only now just kind of getting back to it. So, yeah, I think that's probably it. But, again, it just depends, I think. Kavadi also asked, is a troll in Central Park actually good, or am I just remembering it with nostalgia glasses? I don't know if it's good. I do know it's unhinged. A lot of the stuff from the 90s, man, was just, like, so weirdly ambitious. And I think that's really just super, super intriguing. Cool Person asked, what extra attributes would make these creatures more interesting to interact with? And I think the answer to that question is pretty simple. I would love to see how those entities interact with established human communities or established communities of non-monstrous creatures. I'm one of those people that finds social commentary in their role-playing games to be really fascinating, and I think it tells a lot about us as storytellers and us as people. And I just think it'd be kind of neat. So if anything that's missing, the axis of social interaction, societal interaction, I think is a big thing. And then Kavadi asked, what is your favorite rock troll? This is the thing that The Witcher does right, by the way. Kavadi said from The Witcher 3. I love I don't know, it's a two-way, like, the two that I love are obviously the one that's like the Redanian. He's like I think that's the one. There's a rock troll in Witcher 3 that believes he is a recruit for the Redanian military. And if the Witcher pretends to be affiliated with like Nilfgaard or like the Northern Realms, he'll attack them. And by not the Northern Realms, because Redania is the Northern Realms. Temeria specifically. But yeah, I love him. He's great. Sabasun said, where would you say the defining difference between trolls and other similar mythological fantastical creatures such as giants and ogres? Not sure if you're going to bring up the various Scandinavian and Nordic trolls, but Icelandic trolls have a lot in common with descriptions of ogres and other cultures. This is a really, really great thing. So in terms of giant versus troll, I think size is the big thing, right? When we're talking, again, this was not something I did quite as much research on Sabasun, so that's one of the things that, like, I want to honestly, talk about, right? But in general, from the stuff that I read, the tangential things that I've read, and the actual myths and folklore I studied about giants, not for this video, but prior to this video, just in my own regular research, size would be the big one, right? Trolls generally tend to be very large, but like if we're talking about the giants of like Anglo-Saxon myth, they are massive, sometimes continent-sized, right? Like we think of like, or even Gaelic folklore, right? The Giant's Causeway in Ireland is a massive land bridge of hexagonal stones jutting out into the ocean, and the idea was the giant essentially just bent down and ripped it up from the seabed. Like, that's insane. The difference between, giant and troll in that context is massive, right? Both in power and in size. The same is true in, Norse mythology, right? Where we have the Jotun. They are, again, the massive frost giants, the sons and daughters of Ymir. Just both vast in terms of their physical size, but also vast in terms of their power. So I think that would be the big dividing thing. I will say that, again, the Scandinavian Nordic trolls have different physical features, but for the most part, they do follow similar lines. How are they different than an ogre? I'll be honest, that's going to require more research on my end, because that's one of the things that I don't know if I know enough about to speak on with any, anything else. Tafari asked, is it weird to ask that the video covers goblin reproduction? Like you barely see females. First time I ever saw one was in BG3. Also, what is the lifespan of a goblin? So, Tafari, it depends. Again, this is going to depend largely on if you are talking about the historical interpretation of goblins, in which case, helpful spirits. So, your guess is as good as mine. Do spirits reproduce is a question maybe Iron Bones will have to postulate on. But like, if we're talking about the modern interpretation, I did see a lot of female goblins in folklore and in modern fantasy stories, and they just kind of tend to reproduce like rats. It feels like that has come up often, both for rats, both for goblins and kobolds. And then it gets into some dicier territory when we get to like fiction like Goblin Slayer, for example. The average lifespan of a goblin, again, helpful spirit tends to be hundreds of years, like the story that was found in the Gesta Romanorum. That spirit seems to have lasted a pretty long time, so I don't know if it was a lifespan, more or less as if like... so the way that story ends, by the way, is a knight who is a giant dick steals the horn from the goblin, and the goblin's like, well, you all are dicks, I'm out, peace. And so it's not like that goblin dies, he's just like, oh, humanity doesn't deserve this, and then just pieces out. So I don't know if those have a lifespan, but the average modern fantasy lifespan of a goblin, I think, is generally somewhere between the 5 to 25 year mark. So that's pretty much it. But yes, yeah, you never see one die of old age, Tafari pointed out. So what magic would goblins and trolls use? If we are going on the historical interpretation of it, I think it depends. Goblins in the Anglo-Saxon, the Gaelic myths, the old myths, right, seem to have magic that is all their own. That's probably the thing that they would employ. A modern fantasy goblin, I think, is a massive pragmatist that will pretty much use whatever weapon is readily available to them. It's actually one of the tropes that I like the best about the modern fantasy golem, or goblin, I should say. That's the question's from Cool Person, by the way. Trolls in the modern fantasy parlance, I don't think would use magic, but trolls within the Old Norse legends do seem to echo what I call the Viking pragmatism. So, sidebar, by the way, my sole focus was on the Icelandic sagas. That's what I got my degree in, basically. That was my final thesis. And so the one thing that comes up all the time is what I like to call the Viking pragmatism. Vikings were, are often, I think, more known, not just Vikings, just the Norse in general in the Middle Ages, are generally known more for their savagery, which I think is a problem, because that doesn't seem to be their crowning cultural characteristic. It seems like it's their pragmatism. They'll just do whatever it takes to get the job done. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, we abandon it and we move to the next thing until we find the thing that works. And I think a troll would act very similarly to that. I think they would take a very pragmatic view on magic. So long as it is helpful, useful, and not hurting them, I think they're cool with whatever type of magic it is. Which might make them good henchmen. I think maybe that's partially why they get lumped in with evil. I think sometimes pragmatists often get called more evil than anything else. So could be interesting. Ignacio said, I've seen the question of how humanized goblins should be in an RPG, either a basically demonic thing with a sword that you should kill, or a complex humanoid that, well, I guess you should also still kill because they're bloodthirsty. I understand the want for ethically correct to kill enemies, but it still feels weird to me regardless of more or less humanized. What do you think? Ignacio, dude, spitting hot fire with the questions. That's an insane one. So there's a lot to unpack here, just as a designer and as a writer, but let's I guess go from the bottom up, right? How do I feel about, like, ethically correct to kill enemies? I think it depends on the type of game that I'm playing, right? At the end of the day, and I say this as somebody who is a staunch advocate for safety tools and a staunch advocate for player consent and just, for player empowerment. With all of that said, right, at the end of the day, I do recognize that this is a medium that we're engaging in for fun and that it's pretend, right? One of my favorite games is not a role-playing game, but it's a game about being called Dragoon, and it's a board game about essentially being a dragon and, like, laying waste to villages and subjugating villages. That is like if you think about that objectively, that would be a horrible thing to do. But when you're playing it in the game, right, you're playing with, like, shiny gold-plated dragon pieces, and it's cool, and you're like, I am a big dragon, I'm evil, it's great. So I think it depends on the type of game that I'm playing. With Dragoon, or with like the Conan role-playing games, there's an expectation that I don't really care about the deep inner lives of my enemies, right? There's an understanding. We're working through this sort of mutual contract that these are not real things and not real people, but there's, like, that sort of monkey part of our brain that's like violence fun, right? And so in that case, like, I don't really need ethically correct to kill enemies, right? Like, I'm okay with it. But one of the things that, I really like, and it's part of the reason I've gotten into more character-driven and more story-driven role-playing games, kind of like After the Rain, right? That's the reason I wrote that game, is I like the stories that force me to think like I'm actually there and I'm actually part of the character. If that is the case, then I'm far more interested and intrigued by the goblins are a complex humanoid that, maybe I want to kill, but I don't necessarily have to. It's actually one of the things that I like about Blizzard's depiction of goblins, where they treat them more like pragmatic business people who are, like, kind of scuzzy used car salesmen, rather than just absolutely bloodthirsty. I might want to, obliterate or unalive the scuzzy car salesman that, totally screwed me out of money, but, like, that and, like, the thing that wants to burn and eat everyone alive, those are two wildly different things, so I guess I'm okay with it. So long story short, I think, Ignacio, it just simply depends on what kind of game I am looking to play and what kind of story I'm looking to tell. And I think that ultimately is a question that we should be asking ourselves all of the time, whether we are a game master or a player, a writer, a GM, whatever. So I think that's pretty cool. So And Cool Person echoed that. I feel like humanoid characters are more interesting narratively, and I would agree. Ulfgar, SOS, how rare would monsters like trolls and goblins be in a low fantasy and low magic world? I would say relatively rare, right? Would different peoples with different amounts of knowledge view them differently? Absolutely. I think this is entirely true. Again, a common Witcher W is that, like, depending on where you go in The Witcher, the relationship that people have with monsters generally tends to be different. Some communities seem to look at monsters a little bit more favorably, a little bit more intriguingly. They're like, maybe you're not a horrific thing that I should just drive into the dirt and murder at my first opportunity, right? Like, the idea of a community that knows the trolls are in the woods and occasionally leaves them scraps or like things that the trolls could not make on their own, right? Like glassware potentially, or fabric. And in exchange, every so often they wake up and there's like a gutted and skinned and the hide has been tanned moose that's just kind of sitting out there and chilling out. Like, I think that's a cool arrangement. So I don't see any reason why different communities would have different relationships with monsters. I don't know how common they would be in a low fantasy world, but again, based on the readings that I did and the oral tradition that we know was present, even if we don't have, great records of it, I would say that while they might not have been common or might not be common in a low fantasy setting, I think an understanding of them, a belief in them, even a happy little superstition about them would be common. I think that's kind of cool. Could it be possible that some of them do not believe in their existence because they live far from the wilderness or borderlands, and that could spark different discussion regarding the folklore that forms around monsters in fantasy settings? I love that take. I think that's a great take. And actually, that's kind of how modern folklore works. Like I have grown up in and around Appalachia, and like, I am a man of science and reason and facts, and I can tell you I have been in the woods where it is so dark that I cannot see anything in front of me, and I'm telling you, man, that's just spooky, you know what I mean? And I don't know if that's just the lizard part of my brain going, hee-hoo, get out of the darkness, but it feels like there's a greater power present. I try to explain that to people who are, big city dwellers, and they got no clue. So it's like, whatever. It's the running joke, by the way, this is a tangent, but like the running joke, at least for me, that I've had with a couple people who've grown up in and around the wilderness is like, you can tell when a movie in the woods has been made by somebody who grows up in the woods and by somebody who hasn't. Because when the danger shows up, if the person hasn't grown up in the woods, the movie gets really loud, which is not at all how danger works in the woods. If everything goes silent in the woods, like the bugs, the birds, the small animals, you're screwed. Like, there's something there that they all know that it should not be present. Get out if you can, or hunker down and hide if you can, right? Like, silence is the big scary thing, so I agree. Chris Bates asked, dragon, drake, or worm? What great fantasy, great lizard is my fave? Man, I love you, Chris. It's not even related to it, but I'll always go dragon. That's the thing that continues to drive my love of fantasy, right? Like, we can all pretend that we're so cool and we, sip our elaborate drinks and our, maroon smoking jackets and talk about how great our lives are and that we're sophisticated and beyond such things. But, dude, dragons are dope, man. They're just freaking cool. So, what size does a dragon need to be classed as powerful or threatening? Any size. If we're talking intelligent dragons, Chris, any size dragon's a threat. Any. Like, we forget that, like, even the small dragons are, like, mini flamethrowers with spite. Yeah, they're great. So, yep, give me dragons every time. RE to trolls. Do you prefer the weaknesses as per tradition, mostly just sunlight, or more modern takes? Again, the whole sunlight thing, it might not even be necessarily a thing. Like, I found a couple stories, but, like, the evidence was inconclusive, which is a commonality whenever you're doing folklore. I'll be honest, I kind of like the traditional fantasy take over the folklore take. I don't know, and maybe it's just because, like, I kind of like sunlight being, like, the vampires thing. But, like, there's something so primal about hunting a giant humanoid beast with fire. It just seems neat. I don't know. That's just me. And if you did, all right, what sizes of trolls do you prefer, as they traditionally cover a huge range of sizes? That's something I didn't necessarily, I think I did a great job. I didn't think I did a great job pointing that out, but they do cover a range of sizes. If, I'm writing a fantasy RPG, I like them big, I like them huge. If I were to encounter one in real life, I would like them tiny and mischievous, and I could bribe them with Oreos. And if I did have a pocket troll, what would it do? I don't know. That's a great question. I would like a sidekick. I would like a troll sidekick. That'd be cool. And I'd like to feed him Oreos. I think that's a sick idea. As for what my Oreo eating troll sidekick would do, I'm not sure. I'll have to table that for now. Ulfgar said, and probably be annoying as crap, and the power of green friendship. Yes. If you smash a huge rock troll, does it become many smaller trolls? Chris said that. You know what? That's a Russian nesting troll, and I think that's very, very important. Mass Bandit asked the next question. Sorry, Chris, sorry, I have to talk about the other ones that Chris did. Are gravel-sized trolls the smallest, or do you get grain of sand trolls? I think you do, and eventually you wind up with the rare atom troll. And if you fuse sand trolls, do you get a glass troll? Yes, and that's the only troll that doesn't throw stones because they live in glass houses. Skidoo! Oh my god, I love my life. Was Grendel or Grendel's mom the first troll? What's the oldest troll story ever trolled? Again, we talked about this before. The written one, the only written one, that with the earliest date that we know of for sure, right? That we have a hard, fast date. This is the earliest troll story we can verify as a fact, was the Prose Edda, right? So that's 1220. So that's like the oldest troll story. And Matt Bennett, Grendel is not a troll. And Grendel is not half dragon either, which is what Chris brought up, right? It depends on the translation. There's a lot of controversy in the Beowulf sphere, by the way, in case anyone cares about like linguistics and how stories are interpreted. But yeah, there's quite a lot of like controversy because depending on the translation you have, it's possible that Grendel and Grendel's mother were never meant to be monsters at all, but meant to be depictions of a rival queen and her prince son. Grendel's mom is also not a dragon. In the story, the dragon, that is a modern bastardization of that film. Grendel's mom is a sea-dwelling, it depends on the translation. Sometimes she is called a sea witch, sometimes she is called a sea beast, and Grendel is described as not that. So I tend to lump Grendel and Grendel's mother into this sort of nebulous territory of like monstrous humanoid, but no, not a dragon, also horrifying. And potentially would have been one of those things. So, Cross asked, in the earliest troll stories, it meant more like a magic person. I don't know if that's true. In fact, it does not seem like that is correct. It does seem like the trolls are their own thing. You did point out that in Norse legends, there were like witches who lived solitarily. Again, Grendel's mother might have been one of those. And then I'm just gonna try to find like one or two more questions. And yeah, essentially that was pretty much it. All right. And that's pretty much it. Iron Bones asked, what kind of troll was the bridge troll in the Three Billy Groats Gruff? That is a great question. It seems, honestly, judging by the size, it seems like it would be a troll from Norway. Those, at least in the tangential research that we have, like the oral tradition that we have from those three cultures, those seem like the largest, and thus three goats would make a fine meal for such a large troll. That's probably it. But again, this seems like it's sort of riffing on the underpass of a bridge being very similar to a cave, which is pretty cool. And then Iron Bones wrapped it up by saying a Jack and Coke troll uses a car troll and a revolutionary troll. All right, come join me next time when I do my own game jam and I make Revolutionary Troll, a game about troll anarchists overthrowing the hegemony of the world. All right, with that being said, thank you all so much for sitting through the Q&A section. If you want to participate in this, links in the description below to the Discord. But I'm Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You guys are awesome, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.